If you carry type A positive blood, you are carrying a genetic decision your ancestors made 10,000 years ago. A decision that saved millions of lives, built the first cities on Earth, and quietly wrote a heart-stopping trade-off into your DNA that doctors are only now starting to fully understand. For most of the 20th century, doctors treated type A like nothing special, just a letter and a plus sign printed on a hospital wristband. But once geneticists cracked open the code behind that letter, they found something almost nobody was ready for. Type A isn't just common. In many ways, it's the blood type that built modern civilization as we know it, and the blood type most likely to quietly turn against you later in life. To understand why, we have to go back to the same laboratory, the same year, and the same brilliant mistake that started this entire story. It was 1901. A brilliant Austrian researcher named Karl Landsteiner was staring through a microscope trying to solve a problem that had been killing patients for decades. Blood transfusions were a gamble. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes the patient convulsed and died within minutes. Landsteiner discovered why. When he mixed certain blood samples together, they stayed smooth. When he mixed others, they violently clumped together. He had just discovered the human blood groups A, B, AB, and O. It was a Nobel Prize-winning breakthrough. But almost immediately, European scientists made an assumption that took over a century to fully unravel. Because type A was so overwhelmingly common across Europe, they simply assumed it had to be the original default form of human blood. The ancestral baseline. It felt logical, it felt tidy, and it was almost completely wrong. Decades later, when researchers finally sequenced the actual gene behind blood type, sitting quietly on chromosome 9, functioning like a tiny factory manager deciding which molecular flags get built onto the surface of your red blood cells, the real story came into focus. Type A wasn't some unchanging ancient default. It was a mutation that exploded in popularity at one very specific, very traceable moment in human history. The exact moment our ancestors stopped chasing their food across the landscape and started growing it in one place instead. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, in the river valleys of what we now call the Fertile Crescent, something happened that permanently rewired the future of our species. We call it the Agricultural Revolution. For roughly 200,000 years before that point, small bands of hunter-gatherers had survived by staying mobile, rarely staying in one place long enough for disease to build up around them. But then humans began domesticating wheat, barley, goats, sheep, and cattle. And for the first time in the history of our species, people began living in permanent villages, dense, crowded, surrounded by grain stores, livestock pens, and each other day after day, year after year. That dense, settled lifestyle became the perfect breeding ground for an entirely new category of enemy: crowd diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis, early strains of plague. Diseases that simply could not survive in small, scattered hunter-gatherer bands suddenly had exactly what they needed to explode into full-blown epidemics. And this is exactly where type A enters the story. The molecular flags that type A blood cells display on their surface happen to closely resemble structures found on the outer shell of certain devastating pathogens, smallpox chief among them. Historical epidemiological data pulled from major smallpox outbreaks reveals a chilling and consistent pattern. Populations with high concentrations of type A blood suffered dramatically higher mortality rates than populations dominated by other blood types. Some researchers believe the explanation lies in a kind of biological camouflage. The virus's outer proteins were similar enough to the type A antigen that the immune system was slower to flag it as a foreign invader. It was a genetic blind spot, hardwired directly into the blood. And smallpox tore through farming communities that carried it, generation after generation. So why didn't type A simply vanish? The answer is brutal, and it comes down to raw numbers. Agriculture didn't just create dangerous new diseases. It also created massive population booms. A single farmed field could feed 10, 20, sometimes 100 times more people than the same land could ever support through hunting and foraging. So even while smallpox and tuberculosis quietly killed off staggering numbers of type A carriers in every generation, the sheer explosion in total population size meant type A carriers were still multiplying faster than they were dying off. It's a cold, mathematical kind of survival. Type A didn't spread because it was safer. It spread because the farming lifestyle riding alongside it produced overwhelming numbers of people, even while quietly cashing in millions of lives along the way. This is also why, when modern geneticists map the frequency of type A blood across the globe today, the pattern lines up almost perfectly with the ancient historical spread of agriculture itself, radiating outward from the Fertile Crescent, sweeping through Anatolia, and pouring into Europe alongside the first farmers roughly 7,000 years ago. Type A is not an ancestral default sitting quietly at the root of the human family tree. It is the genetic fingerprint of the Neolithic Revolution still riding along silently in your bloodstream today. But here is where this story stops being ancient history and starts becoming something that affects your body right now, today. Because type A didn't just inherit a disease vulnerability from the deep past. It comes packaged with a very modern cardiovascular cost that clinical researchers are still actively working to fully map out. People with type A blood tend to carry meaningfully higher levels of a clotting protein called von Willebrand factor, along with elevated levels of factor VIII. In plain practical terms, this means type A blood clots faster and more aggressively than type O blood. For most of human history, that was a massive advantage. Faster clotting meant surviving a wound from a hunting accident, an infected cut, or the physical trauma of childbirth in an era with no hospitals and no antibiotics. A slower clotting ancestor simply bled out and never passed on their genes. But in the modern world, where humans now regularly live into their 70s and 80s, that same aggressive clotting tendency quietly becomes a liability instead of a lifesaver. Multiple large-scale population studies have found that type A carriers face a measurably higher lifetime risk of blood clots, deep vein thrombosis, and, most seriously, heart attacks and ischemic stroke, compared directly against type O individuals. The exact same trait that once saved your ancestors from bleeding out on a hunting trail may now be quietly working against you decades later, one microscopic clot at a time. And the pattern doesn't stop at the heart. Type A blood has also been linked across numerous clinical studies to a measurably higher lifetime risk of stomach cancer. Researchers believe this connection runs through the same molecular surface flags responsible for the smallpox vulnerability, flags that may make it easier for certain damaged precancerous stomach cells to slip past the immune system's cleanup process undetected. In regions with historically high rates of a stomach bacteria called H. pylori, the combination of that bacteria with a type A stomach lining has been closely monitored by clinical researchers studying elevated rates of gastric cancer. There is one more twist to this story, and it involves something you feel every single day without ever thinking about where it came from: stress. Several studies tracking cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, have found that type A individuals tend to run with measurably higher baseline cortisol levels compared to other blood types, along with a stronger physiological stress response when placed under pressure. Some researchers believe this may be an evolutionary echo of dense agricultural village life, constant close proximity to strangers, ongoing competition over stored resources, and the ever-present threat of a crowd disease sweeping through the village may have selected for a nervous system permanently primed for vigilance. It's a fascinating and honestly uncomfortable possibility that the so-called type A personality so many people joke about at the office may have a genuine ancient biological root buried directly in the same blood that once built the very first cities on Earth. Just when researchers thought they had type A fully mapped out, one more mystery appeared. There exists a rare variant called the A2 subtype, a weaker, far less detectable version of the standard type A antigen. In routine blood testing, A2 can sometimes be mistaken entirely for type O because the molecular flag it produces is so faint that standard screening tests miss it completely. This has, on documented occasions, led to serious real-world transfusion mismatches, cases where a person quietly carrying this rare A2 phenotype received blood intended for a straightforward type O patient, triggering a dangerous, unexpected immune reaction. Buried within type A, in other words, is its own hidden chapter, a genetic disguise that modern medicine is still learning to read correctly every single time. When you zoom all the way out to the full scale of human history, type A tells a fundamentally different story than type O. Type O is the story of the wanderer, the hunter, the migrant, the survivor of the open road and the frozen land bridge. Type A is the story of the settler, the farmer, the villager, the person who chose to stay, who built walls, who planted fields, who fed the first crowded cities, and who paid the price for civilization itself in a currency of smallpox vulnerability, elevated clotting risk, and a nervous system wired for vigilance, a currency that is still being cashed inside your body today, thousands of years after the last Ice Age farmer ever touched a plow. So the next time you look at a medical chart and see the letter A followed by a plus sign, do not just see a chemical category on a hospital form. Understand what you are actually looking at. You are looking at the blood of the people who built the very first permanent homes on planet Earth. The people who chose to stay when everyone else kept moving. The people who fed the first crowded cities, who buried neighbors lost to smallpox epidemics, and who quietly passed down a cardiovascular clock that is still ticking right now inside your chest. It is not a curse. It is not a life sentence. It is information. A survival trade your ancestors made 10,000 years ago so that you could exist at all today. And understanding it is the first real step toward outsmarting the parts of that ancient trade that no longer serve you in the world you actually live in now. If this changed the way you look at your own blood, drop a comment right now and tell me, are you type A, and does heart disease or clotting run anywhere in your family? Thank you for being here, and thank you for exploring the deep history quietly written into your blood. Stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.